Well, first I'd like to thank MMU for the very kind invitation to come and speak to you today. It's always a good thing to come and give talks. It helps you to think through your ideas and theories. And on the way up, actually, I've reconstructed the slides, which I'm going to be presenting for the first time in this order. So I'm hoping this order is more comprehensible than it was before. So what I'm going to talk about today really is, as it's a kind of public lecture, I'm going to give quite a broad overview, I think, of the major contours of the digital humanities. And really what I do is think through some of the consequences and perhaps deeper kind of theoretical and critical questions that are raised by the digital humanities. Hence, I've termed it the critical digital humanities. Obviously, the way in which I've set up this presentation is very much in terms of, questions raised in the humanities generally, the questions of the human, as it were, for the humanities. But I think, many of these questions are being raised in the social sciences as well. We see moves towards digital sociology. Goldsmith recently launched an MA. And also, we're seeing the emergence of the computational social sciences as well. It's interesting they've chosen the computational social sciences rather than digital social sciences. But nonetheless, in some senses, I think the digital humanities are further along in terms of engaging with the digital. So I think it's an interesting question. And as I say, there are lots of interesting similarities in the questions raised by digital information. So I think it's apt, really, that we're talking about the questions raised by the digital within the digital humanities, especially as apparently 2013 is the International Year of Statistics, which I'm sure you're all fully aware of. And it seems to me anyway that it could well be the case that this year will be the year of digital humanities, particularly I think in the UK, where we're now seeing lots of interest in the digital humanities. This is coming from a variety of different places. I mean, it's been driven obviously by research funding. The research councils are very much driving this agenda. The HRC now has an active digital humanities fellow, for example, Andrew Prescott from King's. But also, you see a big push in the ESRC as well towards computational social sciences. And also there's lots of co-funded projects as well. And, in our new interdisciplinary environment, EPSRC, the Engineering Research Council as well, is doing lots of interesting funding opportunities as well. So this is creating a kind of pool of funds, a funding stream, as it were, that is, encouraging us all to come to terms with the digital humanities, I think. So what is the digital humanities? I think that's a fair question to ask first and foremost. And broadly speaking, I think it's the application of computation to the disciplines of the humanities, broadly conceived. But it's very important, I think, to note that the digital humanities is and remains a contested term, right? It's, if you follow any of the debates, lots of discussions about what this can possibly mean. And I was quite interested to read on the train, actually, that William Pananaka said that we should rename it to the digital liberal arts, right? So it's interesting that, even the term the digital humanities itself is not a set term and remains very much under discussion. But generally speaking, what we're seeing is certain practices related to the humanities being re-articulated through computation, the use of computation to do the kinds of things that humanities scholars have always done, I think. So what I want to do really is to talk about the digital humanities and give you some kind of broad overviews of the digital humanities. And I'm not going to give a particularly chronological introduction, it's more thematic, but I would recommend you have a look at my book, Understanding Digital Humanities, where in the introduction I do give a much, I think, clearer chronological overview of the digital humanities and where they've come from. But in any case, when we've discussed the digital humanities and we've got an idea about the kinds of problematics that are raised in the digital humanities, what I want to do really is to push this a little bit and ask those classic critical questions of the digital humanities. Where does its interest stop? Why do they stop at that place? And here, for example, how might we extend its critique to other registers, for example, economic, political, and cultural, and so on and so forth. And also, a very important dimension for me really is how to develop a kind of critical and humanistic approach to the computation itself, right? So the computational becomes part of the problematic of the humanities. And of course that raises lots of questions in itself. Okay, so first we'll turn to the digital humanities. So if you haven't heard of the Digital Humanities yet, you've done well, because they are kind of a buzz, you know, on the internet, and particularly at conferences, etc. And, you know, in various discussions, we see it being called the next big thing. It's energetic. I love the term, it's theological, that was Stanley Fish. Political, it's very much an issue associated with what are sometimes called alt-acts, that's alternative academics. Those are usually non-tenured or non-academic staff in universities, etc. And this whole kind of discourse of its transformatory potential and progressiveness and so on and so forth. You know, the digital humanities gets very much bound up with these discussions, right? Stanley Fish, for example, thought it was, or had tendencies towards a theological, because essentially what it does, it allows us to somehow enter some kind of ethereal realm, right? The digital is somehow, you know, free from the kind of problematics that the humanities have more familiarly been concerned with. And one of his nicest comments, I think, one that I absolutely love, is that digital humanists love to be surprised, right? That's a hallmark of the digital humanists. So what I'm going to do today really is talk about, you know, some of those aspects of surprise, perhaps, that we see in relation to the digital humanists, and how in which they kind of understand themselves, really. And I think the first thing to note, really, is a striking feature of the digital humanists is often they dislike their own label, right? They're not necessarily all that happy about being called digital humanists. And as I said previously, there's a lot of contestation about what that means, and, you know, how it's applied both to themselves and to academic pursuits in general. And the great thing about digital humanities, it has a very interestingly contested history, and depending who you're talking to, it has different lineages. I mean, you know, some people say it started in 1982, some 1949, some 1736. Some people say it only really started in 2001, right? So there's a real, you know, question over what is and what is not within the boundaries of the digital humanities. The other aspect as well that's really interesting, I think, is that the digital humanities often gets represented, shall we say, as a kind of management-friendly means of disciplining faculty, right? These computational approaches seem very testable, very easily monitored. They're very much able to be aligned with research funding, and many digital humanities departments are actually, you know, closely associated with research funding, external research funding. For example, the digital humanities department at King's College London, for example, has no undergraduate students, right? It isn't really a teaching-oriented research department. It's oriented more towards generating funds in various ways, okay? And that, of course, causes its own problems, I suppose. And of course, the other thing about the digital humanists is, and the digital humanities more generally, is this kind of worry, this concern of the fact that somehow the humanities themselves are being sold out, right? People doing this kind of stuff are essentially, you know, throwing away everything that the humanities have stood for. You know, civilization itself. It's the end of civilization, essentially. And we see this discourse repeated again and again and again. As I was saying previously in the workshop, Stephen Ramsey, a quite famous and prominent member of the digital humanists, and Stanley Fish, have had a very interesting argument, public argument, mostly taking place in the New York Times, ironically on a blog, between this kind of notion of more traditional notions of what the humanities should be, and, you know, a kind of digital humanities idea. So the digital humanities themselves, their kind of history is very fascinating, I think, really. Many of the digital humanities departments that we're seeing today, I mean, obviously there's a kind of rebranding going on of, you know, some humanities departments, but the kind of traditional digital humanities departments, if you like, used to be known as computing in the humanities departments, and there's some very famous examples of these across Europe, particularly. I mean, King's College London had perhaps the most famous computing in the humanities department. I think Glasgow has an old one of those, and Bergen in Norway, North Norway, also had a computing in the humanities department. And really what this department was a kind of support service, right? And so the people that worked in these computing in the humanities departments were there to provide support to the real humanists, okay? The people doing the real work. They were the technicians. And so this meant that the computing in the humanities often had a kind of low prestige status, right, historically. And as the digital humanities itself, becomes much more of a kind of mainstream academic concern, because of course we all now need to take account of the digital. I don't think that's a contentious statement to make anymore. I think it's very few, the academics these days, that are able to function without any access or use of any of these digital technologies at whatever level. And as Kuhn would argue, anyone that isn't will be dead soon. That fact that the digital itself has become much more mainstream means that the digital humanities have had this interesting problematic of re-articulating the kinds of things they do. Right? I don't think they've ever been particularly happy with this status of being a service department, essentially. I don't think they've ever, but they've never been able to move beyond it. Digital humanities is a way of, proclaiming that they're now a proper academic pursuit. And it'd be very interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, particularly now that, as I say, other departments are also rebranding themselves as under digital humanities, and that contestation of what digital humanities is. Now you might ask the question, why is it that suddenly everyone's so interested in rebranding as digital humanities? Now clearly, as I said previously, this is related to the new funding streams. The National Endowment for the Humanities has created an office for the digital humanities, which pours money into these projects. AHRC now has quite a considerable amount of money that it's pouring into digital humanities related projects. But I think also in terms of the general changes we're seeing in terms of education, the kind of marketisation and mass changes we're seeing more generally, and anybody involved in university can't but notice these things. The digital humanities has a certain kind of ring to it, shall we say, in terms of the way in which you present the humanities. And of course, this raises interesting questions about, how should the digital humanities engage with that kind of question, right? What are the digital humanities? Is it a discipline? Is it a field? How does it function? How does it teach? Because often digital humanities traditionally haven't taught. And what should be taught? And we see this, as I say, it's a very live issue, right? The kinds of questions, I was in King's a few weeks ago and they were very much debating about, what would be in an undergraduate digital humanities program, right? They really were puzzling over that question. I think it really is an interesting question. But we are seeing, research projects emerging now. We're seeing digital humanities centres popping up all over the place. And, the development of the whole kind of new disciplinary apparatus, right? We are seeing journals and conferences and all the kind of usual paraphernalia that you expect to have in a kind of discipline. So really this is a move away from what McCartney called the notion of this service department enabling the computer essentially as a kind of servant of research, right? And I still think this is a very predominant way of understanding what computation can do. It's a kind of tool and it does what you want. And it's fairly neutral and so on and so forth. Whereas really, people like McCarthy and others are arguing that it has a more participatory possibility. Computation allows you to ask questions. It can generate questions. It has a kind of agency associated with it as a research method, as it were, a research environment or ecology, perhaps might be a better way to think about it. So, really this is the point that, the humanities, although they've been a bit slow to move towards many of these digital technologies, I think archives and searches have been relatively accepted, right? That's the kinds of things we expect computers to do. But it's interesting how the humanities in particular have clung to certain kinds of, shall we call them, containers for academic outputs. And here, of course, I'm talking about the monograph, the gold standard of academic publication. And again, this is another one of these kind of key issues in the digital humanities. What does it mean to produce an archive? What does it mean to produce a website? What does it mean to produce certain kinds of, ebook or even an ebook reader or some kind of piece of hardware that allows other people to do the research? Because presently, and certainly my university and many of my colleagues have talked about this with me, when you go for a promotion, often a lot of that stuff will be ignored in relation to traditional scholarship. And again, this is very interesting because I think this year is going to be the year in which the book itself becomes highly problematized. And the book is heavily associated with the humanities, right? There's lots of very, very interesting projects in relation to book publishing. And the publishers themselves are really diving into the digital in a really radical way. And I think this year we're going to see real changes in relation to the monograph. But nonetheless, the monograph is still the gold standard. So no matter how much digital stuff you do, the point is finally, at some point, if you're a real academic, it's printed on paper, right? And that's one of the questions, I think, that's going to be challenged over the next couple of years. So this is a kind of boundary between the work of, the academic and the work of the technicians and the tools, right? And this dichotomy, continues. And if anybody's working in this kind of area, you're probably finding yourself drifting between those two zones. And perhaps your supervisor is, saying to you, be careful you don't go too much towards writing tools as you'll have problems getting a job, etc. So these are really interesting questions. And really, I think the digital humanities sort of is the beginning of joining these worlds together, right? So even though the digital humanities does remain a contested term, we can see things changing, I think. The excitement around the digital humanities, particularly in the US, is a sight to behold. It really is. There's a real fervent of discussion around the digital humanities and who's in it and what they're doing and how they're doing it. I was talking to Berthold earlier about this, and I agree with him that it's shortly to arrive on these shores and in Europe as well. I mean, you still don't get the scale of the change that's gone on in the US. But I think if we look at, for example, the MLA, and we see the number of panels, I mean, these are still small samples, of course. I mean, we're talking, out of 796 panels. So 8% of panels in 2013 were digital humanities panels. But these were the most heavily subscribed panels. They were considered the most exciting. These are the ones that appear in all of the write-ups and the blogs, and particularly in the New York Times and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and all these kind of important places that are read by other academics and by management and so on and so forth. So it's certainly got a momentum behind it, I think, and that's just not going to stop. So I think digital humanities is certainly a kind of growing area, a growing field, and certainly an emerging discipline. So what I want to do really is to start thinking about drawing a tentative map of the key issues, as I see it anyway, within the digital humanities. And the kind of, really I'm trying to look at here the kinds of things that are contested and raise questions. And of course this is not a completely comprehensive representation of all the issues that come up, but I think it gives you a good taste for what the digital humanities are involved in. So just to quickly run through them. So first and foremost, unsurprisingly, the digital humanities are very interested in digital technology. Right, that's a key hallmark of the digital humanists. And they really do have this early adopter mentality, right? They love new technologies. They really are happy to jump onto and experiment with technologies in interesting ways. And one of the outcomes of this that's often commented on in relation to digital humanists is the Twitter back channels, right? The Twitter back channels, in a certain sense, have become one of the hallmarks of whether you are or are not a digital humanist. And what I mean by the Twitter back channels are the kind of, discussions that go on behind the conference over Twitter, where people have a shared hashtag and they discuss papers, they discuss research directions, they discuss, the kind of arguments that are being made by the person on stage at that time, and maybe even, kind of a collective formulation of questions to ask the presenter, right? And I've experienced that myself, where people have collectively come to develop a question, which is a very strange experience when you're standing on stage and you're actually up against 10 people who are working together on an interesting question for you. Now this Twitter back channel thing is very, very interesting because obviously it creates a kind of in-group, out-group kind of situation. So many traditional humanists find this quite threatening or perhaps problematic because of the discussions that go on Twitter are somehow not available to them because they're not on Twitter, right? Even though it is a public forum, as it were, it's seen as somehow discriminatory. So that's an interesting dimension to it. But I think particularly it's that early adopter aspect that I think is interesting. The second thing is this kind of computational formalism, if you like, which is digital humanists do have a tendency to talk in computerese. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's no way you can get around that. And not only that, they've learned from the computer scientists the joy of acronyms. So they're very happy to create projects with acronyms as their project titles, and new projects, and also puns as well. They use puns in their acronyms in interesting ways. And there I'll give you an example of some of the ones that are constantly under discussion. Another very interesting hallmark, particularly for me as a theorist related to the digital humanities, is the stress on building things. Right? Again, this is a very contested issue, but this notion of less yack, more hack. And by that they mean less talking, i.e. less theorising, less, if you like, critical scholarship or scholarship about scholarship and, you know, that kind of stuff, and more hacking stuff, more programming, more using the technology, right? And that's very interesting, again, in terms of, you know, how for traditional humanists that kind of looks almost like an anti-humanist position, I think. In its perhaps anti-theoretical or less than critical approach. The next thing, and again I'm sure this won't be a surprise to you, is this notion of open access. Right? Open access is the key rallying call for the digital humanities, and there's loads of interesting reasons for that, I think, and I'll come to that in a little bit. But this really draws from this notion that information wants to be free, right? And of course, you know, we all know that's an extremely problematic statement, but nonetheless, it's part of the discourse of the digital humanities. The next thing that is very important is pedagogy, interestingly. There's lots of talks about MOOCs and distributed learning and peer learning and all that kind of stuff in the digital humanities. And again, MOOCs, if you haven't come across them yet, massive open online courses, is a big discussion in the US at the moment. And each of these I'm going to go through in a few moments. The sixth thing that I think is really interesting is the problematic of the university, right? And I think it's really interesting that the digital humanities actually, you know, pay quite a lot of interest to the university, its structures, its functioning, and really, you know, how they fit into those structures, right? They think very much, and I think because they're a nascent discipline, you know, they feel somewhat outside the university in a sense, and so they want to write themselves into the university in some sense. And of course, this links to the structures of the university. For example, you know, the monograph as a key indicator within the university. And lastly, these issues which I've termed under epistemological concerns, which is questions over the kinds of things that traditionally humanists found important or interesting. So, for example, close reading, deep attention, and especially, you know, the disciplinary authorised readings and writings that took place, the disciplinary approaches that were taught to undergraduates, particularly in the way in which you did your discipline, you know, the things you did to make in your discipline, if you like. So, in the digital technologies, for example, and as I say, I mean, it's really worth looking at the digital humanities communities. For example, Haystack is a really good place to start if you're interested in looking at the discussions that go on in the digital humanities. But even a very, you know, quick glance at the digital humanities communities, you'll immediately see a kind of excitement over these new technologies and experimentation and discussion. And in that sense, it really is reminiscent of, you know, technical communities discussing new technologies. They've got this very techie feel to them, and many of the people involved, you know, are quite technologically advanced in the kinds of projects they do. I mean, it's also interesting how they, you know, think and challenge some of the existing structures in university. I mean, Matthew Kirschbaum, for example, professor of English at Maryland, I think, when he was doing his PhD, one of the things he did was he actually problematized the learning of a foreign language on his humanities PhD, and said, well, actually, it would be more useful for me to learn a language, but not a foreign language. In fact, I want to learn a computer programming language. And interestingly, they allowed him to learn a programming language in lieu of a foreign language. So it's interesting how the digital humanists themselves, you know, re-articulate, I think, the way in which certain structures have been set up in the university. The thing, again, that's very interesting, and you easily see this, I think, sometimes from the digital humanists, is, and particularly people that move over from traditional humanist activities, is that the technology can be quite dazzling. I mean, it is amazing some of the things you can do now with the technology. And of course, this is just going to get more and more impressive as time goes by. And being dazzled by the tech means that, many questionable digital humanities projects exist out there. And of course, at the moment, I don't think have good standards for judging different kinds of projects. But nonetheless, the other thing that dazzles the humanists, I think, is that these technical projects can also generate large audiences outside the university, right? You can get in Wired, you can get on Reddit. There's a much more interest from the public when traditional humanist projects are rearticulated through a technological medium, right? And that's just a very interesting question. And it's, I think, a bit sad, really, when you think about the complete lack of interest by the public in, many humanist activities, like monographs, for example. Very few monographs are actually read outside of, standard academic pursuits. Yet, projects that are rearticulated can be, have a massive amount of interest. And of course, this really is, drives a kind of, shall we say, a kind of populism in the digital humanities as well, which is quite interesting. So there's a heavy focus on technology discursively, as well as in project terms. And of course, there are dangers there. I mean, it seems to me one of the biggest problems is that it's so easy to articulate a digital humanities project in terms of the technology, right? And I've talked to AHRC about this, because I think when you call for technical projects, they're very complex, and sometimes there isn't that much space to actually articulate what the actual humanistic value of a project is. So there's loads of interesting questions to be raised there. The other thing that's interesting, I think, in relation to the digital technologies is this early adopter mentality translates into a progressive discourse, which you sometimes see emerging from the digital humanists. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's contrasted with the kind of old-fashionedness of the traditional humanities. And, this is obviously extremely problematic, and I think both sides are very unhappy with this kind of situation. But I don't think it's a surprise that, this fast-moving technical landscape somehow appears as kind of with it. And of course, management in universities are also, quite happy to buy into this discourse of the new shiny project that they can then throw their PR departments at. But these dichotomies, I think, are both real and imagined, right? So there are moments when these technologies do create new possibilities for research. There's no doubt about it. It's not merely a discursive thing. And also, they can be productive and unproductive. I've seen humanities teams tied up in knots over technical projects, and equally very, very productive work that's output from it. As I said previously, there's the big question of digital humanities outputs. There is a kind of nuttiness in our existing university structures that you create these amazing interactive visual dashboard systems that allows you to fly through some incredible humanities projects, and then you have to write it up in a monograph. And it's this kind of static format. And I think it is a real shame that those kind of outputs are not necessarily treated as seriously as I think they certainly need to be. So these are key sites of contestation, as I've said. The other issue is this kind of notion of digital formalism. Much of the early history of the digital humanities, or computing in the humanities as it was, has been really, building archives and developing the kind of research infrastructure and technical infrastructure to allow people to use these digital technologies. And lots of money has been sunk into these projects over the years. And there are lots of problems with some of these projects as well. Many of them are kind of, what are called digital humanities islands. It's one of the big problems that digital humanities have of, creating projects that don't interoperate and essentially are kind of standalone. Money runs out, and essentially it gets wiped off the web. I mean, this is one of the big problems with digital humanities work. But nonetheless, there's been a big push, I think up until now really, of these this archiving and digitisation and so on and so forth. And in my book, Understand Digital Humanities, I talk about this really as a kind of like a first wave of digital humanities, if you like, where it was very much about making non-digital stuff digital, essentially. The other aspect of that has been what I call the second wave of digital humanities, which is really taking account of digital stuff, right? So now you get born digital content. And that also has been very much associated with building these kinds of archives as well. And we're getting a lot of these archives. And it's the same thing happening in the social sciences as well, where you're getting huge and very often interesting archives. And the question then is, how can we build on these things? This computational formalism, this abstractness that the computational brings to research projects, I mean, I think a good example of this really is the kind of XML and TEI discussions that have been going on since the 1980s. And, it's quite a sterile discussion, quite technical, about how you should and shouldn't encode data and so on and so forth. And you may not think it sounds particularly interesting, and it isn't, but the emotions it arouses are quite fascinating. If you are interested, definitely check out the humanist mailing list, for example. That constantly reignites every so often, and there's a big argument about what should and shouldn't be done. But also, these early digital humanities projects got really wound up, and I've seen some really interesting examples of this, of comprehensiveness and exhaustive archives, right? What do you do when you've digitized the major part of a collection? Well, then you want to digitize everything that maybe that person, that author has ever done, regardless of its value. And one example of this is the Newton project at the University of Sussex, where they have an absolutely comprehensive archive of Isaac Newton's works. And I mean literally everything. So his shopping lists, his childhood drawings, what have you. I mean, anything he ever wrote is in the archive or shortly to be digitized into the archive. And that's kind of, you wonder about the unproductiveness and how far that can go in a purely archiving sense. How do we move beyond that? So here I'm just going to sort of quickly mention this XML TEI debate that goes on continually. And I don't think you can be involved in a digital humanities project without at some point having to engage with this discussion, because a decision does have to be made about it. But one of the problematics, of course, with this computational formalism is there can be an over-concentration on the problems that computation can solve. And I think often the way in which Research Council cores are set up, encourages this fitting of humanistic projects within a computational frame. And of course, there's a kind of reductionism that happens as well when we unproblematically do this. And I call this notion of computation as a kind of horizon, as it were, of what we can do as a kind of notion of computationality. And I talk about it in one of my previous books if you're interested. But I think in regard to this discussion, I mean, without a doubt, computation and computational categories are reconfiguring, our disciplines. I think without a doubt. And it's this reconfiguration around a constellation of concepts, particularly drawn from computation, I think, will be a really interesting question to think through. This computational formalism, again, just to say, I mean, this use of acronyms, puzzling concepts, naming conventions, etc. And, of course, programming source code itself, right? There's a lot of programming that goes on. Programming is a skill. Humanists very rarely have much contact with this kind of stuff, and it's a whole world unto itself if you're from a traditional humanist pursuit, as it were. So these digital humanities projects, as they re-articulate themselves, or as humanist projects articulate themselves within this computational register, right, you get a very technical discussion, and it's very easy. And I've experienced this myself when I've been involved in these projects. Very quickly there's a move to very technical discussions about, concrete programming languages, technical systems, data formats and all this kind of stuff. And there is a real danger there with this kind of digital driving the project. And the other thing that's very interesting about digital humanities projects, particularly in the UK, is the website becomes a really important marker of a digital humanities project. You have to have a website, right? Regardless of what your project is, you have to have a website. And then everything sort of hangs off the website in a problematic way. And again, this is really interesting in terms of limitations on what the digital is, because clearly the digital is not just websites. The other thing about this computational formalism is it's also very aligned with many people in the computational industries themselves. So Google, for example, yesterday it was that the Google CFO announced that Google wanted to fix this broken world, which I thought was a very interesting statement. And this notion really generally, and I haven't really got much time to talk about this, but the notion of augmented humanity is really interested in relation to how Google understands what computation can do for humanity. And of course, humanity as a site of interest for the humanities has very interesting overtones, particularly when Google, for example, now is actively getting involved in digital humanities projects, also funding digital humanities projects. I mean, ESRC a couple of months ago announced a Google co-funded digital projects. So, you know, this notion of what the humanities is really problematized here in interesting ways. And of course, I mean, you know, for anyone interested in critical theory, this computationalism and a tendency towards a kind of instrumentalized rationality is a really important question that remains to be discussed. So a key issue for the digital humanities is building things, the notion of more hack, less yack, very, very strongly articulated and contested, I think, within the digital humanities. And essentially this is programming, right? Writing things, programming things, gluing things together, putting up websites, right? And I think it's very laudable that this is also part of the digital humanities. They're very keen to get involved in these activities and, you know, generate some really genuinely interesting work. But this has meant that there's been a general move away from theoretical concerns that were the traditional, you know, questions raised in the humanities, right? So digital humanities, there's no doubt about it, lack a critical engagement and lack a kind of theoretical engagement as well. So there's an interesting space there that's opened, I think, really. And, you know, one of the interesting things about this making things, it's very easy for that then to be linked to a kind of vocationalism or employability, as we're now calling it in the universities. And this has been linked, you know, in digital humanities and by people outside digital humanities. And this notion of marketable skills, right? It's a dangerous road to go down, of course. But the links are easily made, and of course, these are links with computational media, and, you know, we're all having to, you know, explain how our students are going to get jobs, and, you know, digital humanities treads a fine line, I think, between, you know, becoming a kind of a programming apprenticeship or, you know, design, web coding, and so on and so forth. You can see how it's very easy for those connections to be made. And also then you can see how the detractors towards the digital humanities get concerned that essentially it's a kind of neoliberal entry into the humanities themselves, right? And this uncriticality, particularly when it's often the management who get most excited by the digital humanities, right? They want to impose a new digital humanities department or a new digital humanities school and just pull everyone along. The open access issue is a very important issue for the digital humanists. It's very interesting to ask questions why that is the case. Again, I mean, you know, it's amazing how much this has become such a key issue this year. There was a big article, I think it was in The Guardian a few days ago, about essentially the historians got their knickers in a real twist over gold open access and the worries that gold open access, that for those people who don't know that, that's essentially paying for your journal publication to be published. When it's published, it's then freely available. But the problem with that is every gold publication costs around £1,000, right? So you can imagine if the university is paying that money, they can then pick and choose which of the academics in the department get published. And it's a short jump to a kind of very managerial monitoring and picking and choosing who and who does not get published. And of course, if you don't get published as an academic, your career's over. So there's a real worry of this kind of managerialism associated with open access, but also open access archives and data and so on and so forth. Now, what's very interesting about open access, I think, is it has been an interesting way for the digital humanities to position themselves away from kind of instrumentalizing logics, right? So they talk a lot about the kind of democratic potential of open access, a lot of notions of, you know, an ability to talk to, you know, the global south, for example, because they could then access these kinds of journal publications. And also it allows them to link with the kind of notion of, you know, the public or the common. You see these phrases appearing quite a lot in relation to the digital humanities projects because, of course, the public sphere, the public as an institution, taxpayers fund research, right? And it makes a nice, interesting connection with the kinds of things digital humanists want to do and access to it. And, you know, the digital humanities have been really instrumental, I think, in revealing some of the very questionable practices of the publishing industry. And anybody who's published anything will realise what I'm talking about. I mean, the publishing industry, particularly journal publications, has turned into a pretty tawdry situation with them essentially milking the universities and using free labour of academics in order to produce the kind of gigantic profits that they're producing. So it's been very useful, I think, for digital humanities in that way. That's weird. Has my computer crashed? Oops. Okay. Now this allows them to contest those claims of neoliberalism, of course, which so it has an interesting political function. That's not to say, you know, people who articulate open access don't care. I think they do care, but I think the secondary aspect to it is very interesting. And also the other side that I think is very interesting in relation to open access, it also allows them to sidestep the problem of scholarly publications per se, because sometimes it's very hard to get certain kinds of digital humanities projects published. Well, then a quick way around that problem is actually to set up your own journal, right? Set up your own open access journal on the web and essentially bypass the gatekeepers of the traditional humanities. And also it kind of fits in with that whole progressive radical discourse of, you know, the problematics of previous ways of engaging with scholarship. And there's some very interesting examples of this. I mean, the Journal of Digital Humanities, for example, did a very interesting project of open peer review on, I forget what the name of the project was, the Theory of the Book, or whatever the website's called. So they did an open journal peer review process. Vectors, of course, is very interesting for doing lots of different multimedia things on the web. A-Modern has got a very interesting journal edition, actually, this month on the problems of publishing. I really would recommend you read A-Modern. But essentially, you know, there's a lot of interesting experimentation going on there, and this sidestepping the problem of scholarly publication, I think, is certainly part of that. Also, you know, one of the interesting things about these new journals is also it opens up the question of the containers that we've taken for granted in, you know, publications more generally. You know, why is the book a certain length? Why is a journal article a certain length? You know, why can you only do X and Y? You know, why can't you do other things? And so, for example, Stanford Literary Labs is experimenting with this notion of pamphlets. Nick Mumford is talking very interestingly about an alternative to blogging or the journal publication, and instead writing technical reports, which is borrowed from the kind of technical and engineering disciplines, and argues this could be a kind of, you know, a semi-journal article that would be very useful for certain kinds of project publication or journal publication. So there's loads of interesting experiments going on there. And of course, open access taps into this big discussion that's been going on forever, really, over open and closed technologies. And of course, open's always considered better. And it plays out in this new political economic world of Google versus Microsoft, for example. And as I said previously, you know, Google's quite understanding of what's going on here. And it also heavily buys into open access because, you know, it needs to be able to index stuff. So it is very keen to fund certain kinds of open access work. And of course, the publishers themselves are very concerned about this move to open access. I mean, it really does threaten the entire political economy of traditional journal publications. So it's a very interesting area. In relation to pedagogy, I think this is a very interesting move. And again, it, you know, raised interesting questions about why this has become such a key debate in the digital humanities. I think part of it is because traditionally they haven't necessarily taught, and you know, if you don't teach, maybe you're not a real department, and so you need to somehow deal with that issue. But also there's this notion of curation as well, high quality content. I mean, all these terms are bandied about and, you know, extremely problematic in many senses. And the links between pedagogy and, you know, the technology, I think, are really interesting as well. And there's huge amounts of money sloshing around there as well, and private providers are obviously moving in and we know this in the UK with the launch of private universities, etc. Just a few quick words on MOOCs, which I'm sure you've all heard of, or shortly will. These are the major ones: Coursera for profit, Udacity for profit, edX, which is not for profit, and many others launching these educational platforms. And again, I mean, you know, there's a whole debate about it, which I can't go into here, but I mean, essentially what they do is cherry pick lucrative teaching programs and repackage them. The idea really is to, you know, supply some kind of access to traditional universities' content, which somehow not yet quite revealed, they will charge for and make a profit from, right, essentially. So this is a real interesting, I think, problematic for the university more generally. There's traditionally thought of as two kinds of MOOCs. There's these connective MOOCs that came out of Ivan Ilyich's work, and this notion of participatory learning, etc. And the other side really is these new ones, these Coursera type, prestigious universities signing up, well-funded, duplicate existing courses and act as a kind of both a kind of PR engine for their recruitment, but also more interestingly a real threat to the sort of other universities, the mid-range and the lower-range universities. The big question at the moment really is accreditation. I think Stanford started accrediting some of its MOOC courses, but think about the consequences of accreditation if your students could start doing Coursera courses and bring them to your university. Why would you hire a political philosopher in your department when they could do a political philosophy course at Stanford or whatever? Really interesting how this is going to play out in the university, I think, and going to raise us some real problems. These education platforms, as I said previously, with any technology, they're not just tools, I don't think, but also they're promoting external pressure on the university for reorganisations, and I think this is really going to accelerate. The model is interesting. They all have slightly different models, but this is one that I've seen described, which is mass education, ease of delivery, so 15-minute lectures with like little tests at the end of it, so you get these kind of like real bite-sized packages of modules. And of course, the real threat really is to drain the most popular courses out of a traditional university, right? They really can empty out, or potentially empty out these universities. And this is a real issue. I mean, I've talked to colleagues at the kind of what are called squeezed middle universities, and they're really worried about this. They're very, very concerned about it because they think they will have to accept the accreditation of these MOOC courses, right? And that means that they're going to have to have staff cuts and all these kinds of terrible things. In the UK, we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff, this new vocationalism, and of course the digital humanities easily writes itself into this, and I think it's going to be a real balancing act for the digital humanities to not get too closely concerned with those questions. In terms of the university, I'll just briefly go through some of the questions. I mean, of course, there are economic pressures. I mean, more so now with cuts in funding, new teaching and so on and so forth, but also these technical pressures, which you might not think would be such an issue for the humanities, but I think coming particularly through the publishing industries, which are at the moment going through real crisis in relation to digital technologies, they are really questioning the monograph themselves. They don't want to publish them anymore. Edited books, they don't want to publish edited books anymore. And with those kinds of changes, it's inevitable that academics are going to have to, I think, face up to these problems. And it'd be interesting to see how that kind of develops. But also, pressures coming from management and control are really interesting and problematic in many ways. And this whole bibliometric argument, I mean, if you haven't had a look at Google Scholar, you should definitely take a look at it. It's a remarkable computational system. It's just incredible. If you have publications, I recommend you put your data in there and you can see anyone who's ever cited you. I mean, it's just amazing to drill through it. But also it now also suggests readings for you based on your citations and the kinds of things you publish. And it's pretty scary the extent to which it can identify the kind of academic you are. And of course, I've seen, bizarrely, that some universities are now asking for you to supply your Google Scholar bibliometrics as part of the application procedure, right? So, this again puts challenges on the university. I don't really want to go through all this because I can see time is going on, as always, and I've only got to number 6. Essentially, really, as I said, I think this notion of instrumental logics that get associated with the digital humanists are unsurprisingly, problematized by more traditional humanists. Sometimes this is talked about in terms of the dark side and the light side of the digital humanities, which I quite like. Obviously, it's a simplistic binary, but I still think the dark side of the digital humanities is a wonderful term. And this really is, questioning these kind of movements that are happening to universities worldwide, particularly the humanities, right? why is it the digital humanities have suddenly emerged now, and why is it the humanities, the traditional humanities, are in such crisis? And of course, there's a whole discussion about the kinds of things the digital humanities easily buy into, and certainly, as I said previously, it's bureaucratic, technocratic logic, MPUs, the ability to divide faculty and create these non-tenured ALTAC support workers, and think particularly of the number of research assistants that are generated by digital humanities projects on 2-year contracts. I mean, I've seen people on mad contracts where they get like, I don't know, 0.2 here, 0.4 there, 0.4 there. And the places they can be in, I mean, you could be in Edinburgh, London and Warwick. And, I mean, how people manage to move around on one job is just truly scary. And as I say, this is interesting in terms of, controlling the kinds of things academics do. Okay, so Grusin, I just want to draw attention to this. I think it's a wonderful distinction. Grusin raised a question about the distinction between the optimism of the digital humanists, why are they so optimistic, and the downbeat tone of the chronicles, the crisis humanities. I think he really nails it with that term, the crisis humanities. There's no doubt about it, the humanities self-understanding is one of crisis and concern. I don't really want to talk about this, I haven't really got enough time, but Silicon Valley estimated that globally the education industry is worth 1.3 trillion, and they would really like to get some of that money. I just want to briefly talk about some of the epistemological questions. It's interesting that they echo some of the kind of famous debates. I mean, here Windelband's a nice distinction between nomothetic research and ideographic research. So this is the idea that the sciences have this kind of notion of general laws and facts and so on and so forth, and in the humanities, etc. This is this much more cultural and historical work that's done that's qualitatively individual, and you can't reduce it in this way. And of course, the digital humanities, do things that we wouldn't have traditionally thought possible. Some of the means for analysing, for example, textual work have really progressed over the last 10 years. And it's truly incredible some of the things you can now do in terms of this. And I think this distinction returns really in the debate over patterns versus narrative, for example. We get these dichotomies that are constantly being played out in these discourses of the digital humanities. And this relates to this perceived crisis, shall we say, of kind of close reading. And I mean, I'm sure anybody who teaches will recognise the reluctance of students to read, right? Reluctance of students to read books, for example. Trying to get my students to read books is a complete nightmare. But even just articles. I talk to my colleagues in German studies, and it's fascinating the extent to which they're every year having to cut down the required reading because students just will not read that material. But of course the other side of that is that the students then come back with really interesting and innovative ways of producing essays. So for example, they search Google Books and they find books that have been forgotten, that are dusty, and they produce interesting quotations from really bizarre places. So there's an interesting situation there. Some of the proposed solutions to these problems are, for example, distant reading, very associated with Moretti. The short form Humanities Plus, which I quite like. Humanities Plus is an interesting notion of Alan Liu. Cultural analytics course, Lev Manovich's work is very interesting, and perhaps the strongest proponent of a kind of computational formalism and the notion of patterns. Or this kind of sort of tangential but nonetheless interesting situation at University of Amsterdam, for example, Richard Rogers and his digital methods work, particularly the short form digital methods, I think is really interesting. There's also an interesting scientific turn that you see. I mean, the kind of claims to neuroscience in Catherine Howell's recent work is rather both bizarre and interesting. This engineering turn, I mean, Stephen Ramsey, I think, definitely has that very strongly within it. And, just generally a kind of epistemological and methodological innovation. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm sure you'll recognise at least some of them. These are, constantly playing out interesting ways. I noticed that the social reading is getting a real interest at the moment, the individual versus social reading writing, which I think is very, very interesting. And the whole notion of, for example, book sprints seems to be taking off in interesting ways. But you know, these are kind of like a really interesting map of how the humanities and the digital humanities work against each other. You know, again, I can't talk about this very much. I am really going over my time, and I really would like to get to the critical digital humanities. But I just want to quickly note that, you know, one of the interesting things about, you know, recent growth in the power of computation is the ability to take on those functions that traditionally were thought cognitive and human, right? The ability for computation to do things that we didn't think they would ever be able to do, you know, really problematizes questions of what is humanity. There's an interesting book actually by Steve Fuller called Humanity 2.0, which is raises these questions from a social science perspective, but nonetheless very interesting, I think. And also, you know, and again, I haven't really got time to talk about it, but this whole notion of access to human processes is very interesting. The Mechanical Turk, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's piecework for people globally. So you pay people like half a pence to you know, translate a couple of words or whatever. Getting used a lot in digital humanities projects. TaskRabbit, very similar. And of course, you know, for a humanist, it's a little bit problematic when you're paying people like 0.5 piecework to do translation work. And, you know, it really raises questions about what it is you're doing as a humanist when you're creating this kind of odd working environment for people. You know, you're engendering certain kind of non-humanist notions, I suppose. But also the whole kind of new social ontologies, I think, of the humanities are really interesting. This notion of big humanities, you may have heard of, team-based humanities working, real challenge for us. Highly individualistic humanities scholars, I think, in the future. And I just want to very quickly note these interesting movements that are associated in some sense with the digital humanities. That's kind of post-humanism more generally, but you get this kind of computationalism, the speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, which you may have heard of, the non-human turn, and, you know, the moves towards a kind of in-humanities more generally. I think really interesting how the human is argued that should no longer be the concern of the humanities. I think there's a whole interesting discussion to be done then. Can't show you this, unfortunately, but it's very interesting. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to go through my last little bit, which is my kind of contribution on top of this, really. It's a question, I mean, what should we do in relation to the digital humanities? And you won't be surprised that I'm going to argue that, you know, really what we should be doing is kind of bringing the critical back and, you know, bringing out the contextualization, the historical and the philosophical questions that are raised by these research tools, which, of course, I argue create the conditions of possibility for certain kinds of work. So, I mean, how could we do this, really? I mean, how could we, you know, push forward these kind of critical approaches? And I mean, you know, there are numerous ways of doing this, but I mean, we have to, I think, start bringing the critical and reflexive dimensions into these digital humanities projects, right? It seems to me that it's so easily pushed to the side, and, you know, it becomes very hard to argue in a computational register for certain kinds of critical work. And here I'm just going to list some, you know, quick examples. I mean, you know, the whole questions raised by critical theory, but also theoretical work on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality and class, for example, and Transform Digital Humanities, the collection of scholars under that banner are doing some very interesting work there. But more generally, the historical, social, political contexts and so on and so forth around digital transformations, work that's both research and practice led, I think, is needs to be thought through really carefully in relation to this, and often the funding doesn't really allow time for this kind of work to do. Its own historical context and theoretical limitations is barely theorised, I think, in the digital humanities, and needs to be. I mean, you know, the question of political praxis, I think, remains an important question for any kind of critical project. I mean, again, it's how you would create space for that. This whole division between theoretical work and building things, I think, is extremely problematic and needs to be engaged with. And, you know, more generally, a kind of cultural and critical political economy of digital humanities more generally. I'm not going to have time to kind of pick up one of my areas because I really am running out of time. But I mean, I would suggest you look at the kind of software studies and critical code studies approaches. Well, I think there's some really interesting work being done, really. And which raises important questions for the digital humanities more generally, you know, asking questions, for example, how do medial changes create epistemic changes? One of the kind of key questions of this kind of, you know, medium theory and medium theoretical informed approaches. So, yeah, I mean, for example, building things, well, we don't just need to build them, we could also hack them and critique them. I mean, creating critical software, for example, would be an interesting thing to do, I think, in digital humanities work. So, I just lastly want to say a little note that, having been a kind of critical scholar on a number of digital humanities projects now, it's interesting that what you do when you bring the critical to a digital humanities project is you slow it down, right? That's the fascinating thing about the critical, because you're asking questions all the time. So you get on everybody's nerves who's trying to get on with producing this project, because you have obviously a time-limited project. You've got to get it done. There are lots of technical challenges, but when you bring in these critical questions like why are we assuming certain gender characterizations or what have you, people can get quite annoyed with you at the 49th meeting you bring this issue up or what have you. Now, this means you essentially, as a critical scholar, become a kind of grit in the machinery of digital humanities projects. Now, I actually think that's a very productive thing, right? Because as a result of these debates, I think better projects emerge. But it's interesting that so far anyway, the research councils haven't made spaces for those kinds of debates for digital humanities projects. So, I'm really call for that kind of change to be made. And I think it's crucial that we do that. And also, it's crucial that humanities scholars more generally, work to create spaces for these kinds of questions. Slowing down these projects, I think, is an important part of what a critical digital humanities project can do. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I have managed to get to the end of my slides, and thank you.